And for more on the debate of China's economic prospect and the next 5-year plan, I'm joined here in the Beijing studio by Mr. Robert Koepp, who is the author of the book Betting on China. And also in Washington, D.C. in the United States, we're joined by Mr. Scott Kennedy, director of the Project on Chinese Business and Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to our program. First of all, the 13th 5-year plan, nobody knows at this moment what exact the details are. And yet, according to some of the latest information we get, in order to have an all-round well-off society, next 5 years, every year GDP growth rate has to be maintained at about 6.5%. Mr. Kennedy, even though number is not exactly what we're talking about, we're talking about quality, but
this was cut.
Still
connect.
But still, it seems to be extremely important. It seems that Mr. Kennedy has some problem hearing the question. So let me come back to you, Mr. Koepp. 6.5%, next 5 years, every year that growth rate. Given the point that we are having already less than 7, is that likely to happen?
No, it's not. And I would also argue that it's not necessarily as important as people are claiming. I think actually in China, and I can't speak for the Chinese people, of course, but I've lived here for a number of years and I work very closely with Chinese businesses and even talk to government officials and so forth. And I think more than anything, people are concerned about quality of life. I don't know if that's necessarily achieved simply from a figure of GDP growth. I think it has to do more with how the economy is growing, how it's preserving the environment as it grows, for example, which is a big issue here in Beijing and other parts of the country.
Mr. Kennedy, I understand you can hear me now better?
Yes.
Okay, 6.5%. The number is there in order to guarantee so-called well-off society next 5 years. Is it likely to happen? Should we look at the numbers?
I think that growth target is entirely achievable. China still has a very high potential for growth over the next 5 to 10 or even 15 years if it adopts economic reform policies. And I think in some years you might even see growth faster than that. Of course, there are a lot of headwinds that China is facing, but I think 6.5% is entirely achievable.
Mr. Koepp, earlier you said no. So your point?
Well, my point is it's a lot harder to achieve when you're an $11 trillion a year economy. To Scott's point, I mean, it's certainly not impossible. I wouldn't say that, but I don't expect it.
Mr. Kennedy, then, on the other hand, what can we make of the next 5-year plan? Because there will be a lot of things happening in the next 5 years. Of course, 5-year plan is a specific format China used for its planned economy. Things have changed, and yet plan people believe is still important. But given China's rise, given the geopolitics, even just look at the past few months, one will already have a glimpse of the drastic changes. To what extent do you think the 5-year plan will be able to cover all of these possible changes and potentials?
Sure. Well, I think that we need to understand that the 5-year plan is not like the 5-year plans of the Mao era or even the early reform era. These are broad documents that set out a general direction for the economy and society and provide broad targets and suggestions about how to get there. They're signals, light signals about where to go, and it helps provide suggestions for where companies, NGOs, the rest of us ought to be looking. It's a process that's in motion and is adapted along the way. So what I think a 6.5% growth target is relatively reasonable. And you know, there's the policies that they outlined in the communique at the end of the 5th plenum are still relatively general, but if they put some meat on the bones with some specifics that liberalize services, open up the economy internationally, create greater incentives for the private sector, then I think they'll be able to achieve the targets that they've set.
Mr. Kennedy, the reason I'm asking all of these various factors that's changing has a lot to do with some of the recent political and economic development. For example, if TPP can be approved by the US Congress and others, very likely to be implemented 2017. And there might be influences of this specific mechanism on the rest of the world when it comes to how to do trade. And of course, China is a big trading nation. Secondly, even when you look at very near factors, such as the Fed, whether it's going to change the interest rates or not, it would also have some kind of impact on the Chinese economy as well. So given all of these various factors, what do you think about the variables that the 5-year plan have to cover in a way? Mr. Kennedy.
Yeah, sure. So the external environment for China obviously will have an effect on its growth level and the trajectory. I think TPP actually, we shouldn't see it as a regional agreement, but the first step towards a global agreement. And the basic outline of the TPP that we have so far is that it's consistent with the goals outlined in the 13th 5-year plan and the 5th plenum of what we've seen so far. And China should welcome it. Now, the U.S. economy is still doing relatively well. We might see an increase in interest rates here slightly toward the end of the year. But I think demand in the U.S. is still relatively strong. It's stronger than in Europe and elsewhere. And as China moves from being an investment and export-led economy to focusing on services and domestic consumption, volatility in the global economy shouldn't be as critical to China's growth trajectory as it has been over the last 20 years.
Mr. Koepp, do you agree with that? The external factor, how much real impact will it have?
Well, I think the point is well made that TPP could have a positive effect on China. However, again, from my perspective here in Beijing and in working with Chinese organizations, they don't see it that way. They haven't come to embrace it. It's seen as an attack on China. The strategy by the U.S. pivot in Asia against the rise of China economically and in other ways. I think indeed, if China learns a good lesson from TPP and other initiatives like it, it should open its markets more. I'm afraid it may not be learning that lesson exactly yet. We'll have to see. I think there's going to have to be a lot of reform for China to achieve anything like 6.5% growth going forward. I think it's going to be lower than that because I think that process will take longer.
You used the word lessons. I'm not sure whether most of the Chinese economists, particularly if you talk to, would agree with the using of that word. First of all, China, from the Commerce Ministry, has been expressing they are learning, trying to learn about the details of the TPP, even though we do not know much about the details of the TPP, hard to analyze. And secondly, and China has also been proposing some of the regional trade mechanisms such as RCEP and also Belt and Road Initiative. These could also be interesting alternatives when it comes to regional trade mechanisms. So, Mr. Kennedy, what about China's own plan?
Yes.
So we talk about the outside factor. What about its own plans, such as the Belt and Road Initiatives, such as RCEP, such as its so-called innovation and entrepreneurship, all of these new ideas? How much will that have on the real content and concrete numbers of the next 5-year plan, 13th?
Oh, I think they're incredibly important. The plan that as it's been laid out so far and described, is an incremental adjustment to the contents of the 12th 5-year plan with some new details, the focus on Internet Plus, One Belt, One Road, et cetera. And these are, I think, going in the right direction of trying to foster innovation. I think the Made in China 2025 plan could have been written by economists anywhere. Again, if it's implemented with specific reform policies that liberalize the economy, reform state-owned enterprises, open up the economy more internationally, then I think we'll see improved growth. China is both going through a structural adjustment and a short business cycle, and they're at the bottom of that business cycle right now. We might last for another year or so. But I think implementing these reforms would generate a significant reform dividend and we might see greater optimism about the Chinese economy.
Reform, reform, and reform. It seems that you've been repeating that word, Mr. Kennedy. You've been frequently coming to China Beijing, particularly talking to the economists here. What do you think about the pace and the determination to quicken up the pace at this moment? Mr. Kennedy, your judgment?
Sure. Well, I think, I use that word because it's so widely used in China and it's throughout the documents of the party. So I'm not making that up myself.
Of course not.
I think in the short term, actually, what we've seen is probably a less emphasis on specific reform policies and liberalization and more on stimulus, because the economy has slowed down so much over the last 2 years, and obviously we don't want the economy to grind to a halt. You want to avoid a recession, but at some point these greater spending, faster expansion of the money supply needs to be accompanied by liberalization. Right now, China is enjoying high calorie, low nutrition stimulus, and that's going to need to be balanced against more liberalization policies that have been outlined in the Fifth Plenum's communique, and that we'll see in more detail in the Fifth Plenum in the next 5-year plan.
Liberalization, of course, has always been a demand and a call from the foreign businesses doing in China. However, it seems that the Chinese policy is trying to keep a balance about to reform its own system to speed up the changes internally, while at the same time gradually doing its opening up. But on the other hand, Mr. Koepp, we talk about reform. It has always been reflected from the financial reform that's going on for quite some time. We remember Mr. Zhu Rongji, when he was premier, he has been talking his own personal devotion to reform, even using some analogies that has been quoted worldwide. And then the next administration have also been talking about reform. We have already come to the deep water area. And of course, there are new analogies being used over the past 3 to 4 years by the current administration, Mr. Xi Jinping and Mr. Li Keqiang. However, what can bring us, Mr. Koepp, given your knowledge about this country, to the next step of really do the reforms? Of course, there's invested interests. There's still a lot of anti-corruption drives and efforts need to be done. But how, among this complex picture, reform will be devoted, efforts will be devoted?
Well, the notion of reform, and Scott is right, it's not something that he or other people just come up with. It's something the Chinese Communist Party, government, business leaders all refer to, and it's part of what's characterized China's growth up till now and certainly for the foreseeable future. But it is interesting because the reason reform was talked about in the first place is because the system was considered to not be working well. You had a very centrally planned economy, and the idea was to reform it to liberalize the marketplace. I almost would suggest that perhaps the new notion should be to get away from reform and simply focus on openness. The full phrase is 改革开放, right? So it's reform and openness. I think there needs to be more openness, maybe less government involvement to target things.
Interesting. Isn't that linked, Mr. Kennedy?
If I could add to that,
Sure, go ahead.
Yes, so, I actually, although I'm talking to you from Washington, D.C. and I'm American, I think when I'm talking about liberalization, I'm not necessarily saying suggesting more market access for foreign companies, although I think that would be helpful. But if you just take healthcare services, for example, it is very difficult for domestic private companies in China to open hospitals and clinics and compete head-to-head with public hospitals. And that would provide much greater opportunities and services to Chinese population without providing any benefits necessarily to foreign investors, and that would be a big improvement. So even leaving aside the foreign component, liberalization, reducing barriers to entry would be a big improvement in many sectors.
A lot of people pin a lot of hopes on the 13th five-year plan. We don't know the details, but the society has already got excited, not only here in China, but also all over the world. If you look at some of the recent videos, as leaders convened on Tuesday for talks, an online video was going viral among Chinese netizens.
Hey, have you guys heard what's going on in China?
President Xi Jinping's new style?
Yes, and there's more.
The Shisanwu. The what?
China's
All right, the 13-5, that's in Chinese, of course, the 13th five-year plan. Xinhua News Agency, China's official news agency, first posted the video made by a local Chinese studio on its Twitter account using cartoon figures and bright colors to break down China's 13th five-year plan into easy-to-understand, bite-sized explanations. The video quickly caught the attention of web users both within China and around the world. Those are fun, but of course, drawing the plan may not be a fun job. Mr. Koepp, well, we are focusing on the 13th five-year plan. What do you think are the specific points you really wish to see over there?
Well, I mean, one thing I think would be interesting to see, because it was talked about just before the outlines were being formed for the 13th five-year plan, and that's SOE reform. Here again, I mean, this could go either way. The idea is to reduce the size of these major SOEs. If it's done right, it will mean they're more competitive and the market should become more competitive. The fear is, and I would say it's not just by foreign business people and observers, but indeed the domestic business community as well, is instead you'll just have bigger, stronger, but fewer, more dominant state-owned enterprises. So I think that's going to be, for example, a key measure of how realistic is the new five-year plan.
On the other hand, Mr. Kennedy, China has become such a big economy now. Whatever happens to China will have a certain impact in the rest of the world. So what do you expect the most important messages in the 13th five-year plan?
I think there's going to be two things that will be critical. The first is that although China's growth has been relatively fast over the past 30-some years, what we've seen is a decline in the quality of the growth. Total factor productivity is an excellent measure of growth through the improvement of human talent and improvement in the efficiency of the use of capital, et cetera. And that has shrunk. And there needs to be more investment in human capital and talent in making the financial system more efficient. The other thing that needs to be done is that wealth needs to be more evenly shared, and gaps between rich and poor need to be reduced. There needs to be a more complete welfare system. If China can achieve those two things over the next 5 years, that will be helpful not only for China, but for global growth and prosperity as well.
Absolutely. You give a lot of needs list. This is certainly a very positive list rather than a negative list. But for now, we want to thank the two of you for coming over to our program. 13th five-year plan. We are looking forward to more details about exactly what might be included in it. Scott Kennedy coming to us from Washington, D.C., United States. Thank you so much, Scott. And also Robert Koepp here with us here in Beijing. Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.